Okay, guys, I'm back here with the Puritan Bennett 840. So this is the earlier version of the 980. Been around a long time. Okay, a lot of similarities to the other ventilators or the 980 that I've already kind of went through. If anything, it's probably a little bit more user friendly and simple. Okay, same condition here. All right, if you turn this ventilator on while there's an occlusion on the circuit and it's not open to air, you will have a major problem, and you're going to have to shut the ventilator off and turn it back on. Okay, so it's going to come to the startup screen. Let me see here. Let me zoom in a little bit. I know it's probably hard to see. I'm not going to show you how to do that SST. Once again, this should receive a pre-use check. You can actually see on the screen a little bit better here. It shows you that it was passed. This is something we typically do before we have to initiate on a patient. I'll show you how to do that at a later date. Okay, so it brings you to kind of a similar type set of options here. And let me zoom in a little bit. We're going to go down low here. All right, so we're going to go to same patient or new patient. Okay, same patient once again is going to go ahead and bring you up to whatever patient was on there previously, resume the previous settings. We're going to choose new patient. Okay, I do want to say that if you are in a hurry and you hit same patient, you can make all the changes and everything by going into whatever mode the previous patient was in. So you can do it either way. There's no right or wrong. If you know their ideal body weight, that's great. If not, don't necessarily worry about it or anything. This doesn't have any functionality aside from some basic monitoring stuff. So right now I'm going to choose my mode. So by choosing, once again, there's only 3 modes of ventilation: AC, SIMV, and spontaneous. Bilevel is a form of IMV that we'll talk about later. Okay, I'm going to stick with assist control. It shows me for my breath types, I can either do pressure control, I can do volume control, or this VC plus, which is really a hybrid. It's a pressure breath that automatically adjusts to get a target tidal volume. Okay, so we're going to choose volume control. Trigger type, the V or the P. All right, we're going to start with the V trig here first, so flow trig. Once again, you could choose pressure, and it's still quite a bit better than pressure triggers from previous ventilators. I got to hit continue. Okay, it's going to show me my proposed settings here. All right, so it lets me know I am in AC, I am in volume control. All right, so what we're doing is following on the back page, or the second aspect of this little exercise. So it's saying we need to build a circuit and place a ventilator in the following settings: volume assist control, which we are in, a respiratory rate of 18. And keep in mind, I'm going to give you unbelievable amount of guidance on how to decide what is an appropriate respiratory rate, what is an appropriate tidal volume. In essence, we have to decide how much minute ventilation a patient needs and make the best informed decision we possibly can. I'm giving you all these things for starters, but you will eventually be able to come up with these appropriate settings on your own. So we're going to do 18. We're going to do a tidal volume of 450 mils. So even though we chose the ideal body weight before, you can see it's not giving us any stuff like the 980 did, but we will be able to see some stuff here in another screen. We're going to choose a peak flow of 60. You might notice that that's what we were using in the previous ventilator video, okay, with the 980. I will say that a peak flow of 60 typically works pretty well as a starting point for most adult patients. And then we're just making minor adjustments to get that inspiratory time appropriate. Remember, we're indirectly setting our inspiratory time by setting the combination of really 3 things: tidal volume, peak flow, and our flow delivery pattern. Okay, so I'm going to go with peak flow of 60. Let's go to the tried and true ramp or descending flow waveform. We're not going to use a plateau time ever, really. If we want to do a plateau or a breath hold to measure something, we're going to do that on a breath-by-breath basis, not for every breath. There's problems with doing that. I'm going to set a flow trigger. And I like this, it says V-sense, so it reminds you that it's how sensitive a ventilator is. We're going to do 5. And all I'm doing is touching, turning, and then touching again to kind of lock in. We're going to do a peep of the tried and true 5. And let's say 40% FiO2 here. Okay, and these are all settings that were given to you on this sheet. Just like the previous 980 video, it does allow you to set your peak pressure limit at the onset of ventilation, which is good and it's safe. 40 is a pretty good generic value, but once again, we'll fine-tune that and set that based upon what the patient is actually doing once we begin ventilation. So, before I hit accept and actually start these up, just to show you a similarity here, and let me zoom in a little bit better. This ventilator does the same thing. It shows us what our cycle time is going to be based upon these settings. So our cycle time is 3.33, and that was set by changing the respiratory rate. Once again, as we change stuff, look, when we hit that, it lets me know what might change or what is going to change. It highlights that cycle time, so it lets me know that's what it's going to be changing. Okay. We have 0.82 seconds for eye time, so that's a combination of these three things gave us that value. All right. We have an expiratory time, essentially this minus our inspiratory time. It gives us the amount of time remaining for exhalation is 2.5 seconds. And we're going to have a proposed IDE ratio of 1 to 3.06, which should be okay, and we're going to assess after the fact here. Okay, so if you like those, we're going to go ahead and hit accept. Notice these are all red. You can't just start and put your patient on. It's also going to freak out, so we have to hit accept. Once you see the blue tiles, you are locked in. Let me zoom back out here. All right, it's going to tell you waiting for patient connect. So just like with the 980, I said I like to set my apnea settings to reflect kind of what my current settings are, just so I know they have a good safe backup. Patient can't really go apneic and trigger these settings in a controlled ventilation like this. But I'm going to go ahead and set it on this main screen here while we're at it. And you just want to make sure that every time I make a change on a 980 or an 840, I do change these. And I typically leave that F altitude at 100%. It also tells us our apnea time, so 20 seconds. You can get back to this screen by hitting apnea down low. You can see it's all red. I'm going to hit accept. It just happens to show up from this initiation screen and everything like that for us. So you see all these tiles are blue, and it's saying at the top, waiting for patient connect. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hook up my patient. I don't have to confirm anything. As soon as it senses that occlusion, it's going to go ahead and start ventilating. So good rule of thumb, pre-silence all the alarms, because once again, it starts going off. We get the same color scheme, yellow and kind of a lower priority alarms. It has a distinct sound that goes with it, not as annoying as the red or the high priority. It's going to tell you what it is, and it's going to tell us in this case it's been going off over the set limit for less than 30 seconds. As it continues, it does have the ability to go to that high priority alarm. Okay. Aside from that high pressure limit, I don't set my alarms really until I initiate ventilation and I get some readout up here. Okay, this thing is freaking because I'm not running on regular oxygen, so disregard this step, but I'm going to disable the oxygen sensor here. You shouldn't probably be doing that clinically. Okay, so high minute ventilation, I'm going to resilence my alarms. I'm going to access my alarms down here by going to my alarm panel. Okay, you can see what's flashing, and on this one it's showing me, all right, here's what's flashing. The tiles themselves are what your actual alarms are set at. The little thing off to the left-hand side is showing you what your current values. So my high minute ventilation alarm is going off. We'll go ahead and we'll double that. It's a little buffered out, but we'll go with that for now. Once again, you see that it turns red. That means it has not been locked in. We'll go ahead and adjust all my alarms, and it's similar to the 980. We got our peak pressure alarm, so typically 10 to 15 above, and that's appropriate. You don't want your F off. Oh, dang. I accidentally went out and it didn't save any of that stuff. Okay, high pressure looks, or peak pressure alarm looks good. The F total, you don't want that to be off. Typically set that at 30, sometimes even a little bit higher if you need to. Okay, minute ventilation in adults, once again, I'm literally about setting at less than 5. When my license is riding on it, you'll see different. We could do 150 to 300 above here. We've got a set tidal volume of 450. This is looking at your tidal volume. Let's go ahead and we'll do 300 above. And we'll stick with that low tidal volume of 300. You can see that it didn't change that for my spontaneous breaths over here. Shouldn't apply in assist control, but I set them the same regardless. If I don't hit accept, it doesn't change the color back over, and I would lose all my work there. Okay. So from here, if you wanted to change mode, you can do any of that through current setup. You can go back to your alarms. I usually leave that as my alarm setup so I can tell what's going on. So once again, you got real-time monitoring. Here's your core settings here. It shows you the mode, control variable, and all the different core stuff that you set. Okay, so let me zoom back in here. Just like 980, real-time monitoring is up top. Let me zoom in because we're going to do a couple little exercises here, okay? So the first thing is record the current, inspiratory time, expiratory time, and so on. If you touch any of these buttons, all right, that dictate volume delivery for your patient or breath delivery, it's going to show you some interesting stuff. So it brings you back to that same stuff, your I time, your E time, cycle time, I to E. It shows you your predicted your minute ventilation that you're going to deliver with these current settings. and it shows you how many mils per kilo you're giving for your set tidal volume, which is all very, very important stuff. Okay, so our current I time is 0.82, current E time is 2.51, my current cycle time is 3.33, my I to E is 1 to roughly 3. You can see that same thing up here in the monitoring aspect. My current peak pressure, same deal. The total pressure reached as we're trying to cram 450 in at this flow rate is 25 centimeters of water pressure. I got another one, minute ventilation. So VE total, you can see this is what we're delivering. This is what's coming back out of the ventilator. Those are not always exactly the same, but they should be fairly close to each other. Okay, so we got all those values kind of hammered in here. What it's wanting us to do next. Oh, I didn't realize I couldn't see that top parameter. So that's the minute ventilation, peak pressure, IDE, all that stuff here. Okay, so it says, what do you think will happen to the above measurements if we increase the set tidal volume to 550? So why would we increase the tidal volume to 550? A lot of reasons. Most notably could be a blood gas change. Maybe we know their ideal body weight now. We'll talk about all those different things as we kind of progress through this semester and into the fall. Okay, so first off, if I change nothing else but I change my tidal volume, what do I have to think about? So keep in mind what that equation is for inspiratory time, and I'm going to just zoom in on this stuff here right now. Inspiratory time is the relationship of your tidal volume divided by your peak inspiratory flow, really in liters per second. We'll focus on that. So these three buttons, flow waveform, peak flow, and tidal volume, dictate what my inspiratory time is. So let's see, if I were to go and touch this, the good thing about these ventilators is it does the math for you. Old school vents or some transport vents even, you'd have to be thinking about this. So I touch that to isolate it, and I turn my knob up to 550. Look what it shows me. It does all this guesswork for me. My inspiratory time actually went up, right? Because now I'm trying to deliver a higher amount of total volume to this patient, and I didn't change my flow rate. So by making this one vent change, there's some things I got to think about. All right, first, most notably, it's going to take a longer time for inspiration. So my I time would be 1 second. Well, what's that leave with my E time? Well, if I don't change the rate, my cycle time is still the same. If I'm lengthening out my I time, something's got to give. And in this case, expiratory time is going to shorten, and you can see my I to U ratio really, really drops and gets narrow, 1 to 2.3. Might be enough, might not be enough for this patient. The other cool thing it shows you that, hey, our mils per kilo that we're giving the patient is going up roughly almost 8, okay, which is about as high as we typically would ever want to go for any adult patient. Most situations you might even go down lower on somebody, okay? It shows us the minute ventilation we're going to give. So think about what blood gas value going up on that minute ventilation from 8 to almost 10 is going to do here, okay? That'll come later on. So it's asking, what do you think is going to change with all these different things? We talked about the IDE and all these different things. We talked about minute ventilation. Well, what do you think is going to happen to peak pressure? Well, I want to show you one thing before we lock it in. If I hit that, see how it's a light blue? It's not confirmed. I have to hit accept to truly make that change happen. And let me make sure you can see the parameters up top. I'm going to zoom back out. Okay, peak pressure is 25. I'm going to switch over. By hitting accept, you can see the tile turn to dark blue. Watch what happens. The bigger the breath, peak pressure is going to go up a little bit. Okay, so think about it. Lung compliance is mils per centimeter of water. If we want to give more mils, it's going to take more centimeters of water. All right. Likewise, if we're dealing with pressure ventilation, typically more centimeters of water equates to more mils. So you always got to understand, by changing the tidal volume, it's going to change all those things that we just kind of saw take place and everything like that. Okay. So we already talked about what the I time is, E time, peak pressure. You can see our minute ventilation went up, okay, and be thinking about what that would do to your blood gas, most notably CO2 and pH. All right, so let's say we get another blood gas and it still wasn't enough. Well, say we had to blow off more CO2. We're already almost at about 8 mils per kilo, okay, and I'll give you more guidelines with that, but we typically don't want to go any higher than that. So what is a way we could blow more CO2 off? Well, we know we need to increase minute ventilation. By going up on the respiratory rate, we could do that. But we need to think, before we go turning the knob, what exactly is that going to change here? Okay, so let's go ahead and let's propose setting this respiratory rate to 24. You guys learn equations with me where you can make one vent change after a blood gas and not have to do these multiple steps, okay? So we'll take some of the guesswork out. We're just trying to build concepts here right now. So you can see if I wanted to change respiratory rate, it's showing me that as I go to make this change, and it doesn't show me what is going to be manipulated after out of that startup menu, but it's going to show changes that are taking place as I'm adjusting this. If I go up to 24, let's look what happens. Now it turns red and it shows me, hey, you're shortening your cycle time. We know that because these three things set our inspiratory time and it's fixed, that's not going to change. So if that's staying the same, but my cycle time shortening, that just means that I'm having to rob my expiratory time. So look what's happening. As I go up to rate of 24, it shows me what my minute ventilation is going to be. It's going to go up, right? Because if my rate or my volume goes up, minute ventilation goes up, CO2 goes down. But my cycle time is so short, and my I time is still fixed. All right? Look, I only got 1.5 seconds for exhalation. My IDE is going to be 1 to 1.5. That is probably not going to be enough, but we'll take a look here. Okay, let me zoom in, make sure you can see all that stuff. All right, so before I do anything, let's take a look at our graphics. You can see, same deal as before, just smaller. Inspiratory is green, expiratory is yellow. I'm trying to reach back to baseline. It's kind of flip-flop. This is flow up top, and that's a pressure waveform. So I'm going to go ahead and hit accept, and let's see what happens. Let me back out a little bit. You can see my minute ventilation going up. You can see I'm barely coming back to baseline right here. You can see my actual IDE ratio, 1 to 1.5. Most of our patients, this isn't going to work. I got a healthy test lung here. Okay, so we talked about what all of our settings are. What happened, our inspiratory time, expiratory time. We're looking at our peak pressure. Didn't really affect it, but sometimes it can. If you start having air trapping, you can see that value go up. You can see what it did to our minute ventilation, all these different things here. Okay, so it's very important to understand, as you change that respiratory rate, your I time doesn't change on most ventilators. Okay, it robs your expiratory time. It's changing that cycle time, and you got to think about those implications there. Make sure you make a necessary adjustment. Okay, so let's say we got another blood gas, and you go, you know what? The blood gas is still terrible. I need to make some additional changes. What would happen if we would increase the respiratory rate to 32? This ventilator, just like the 980, you can see it's locked me and it started dinging at 30, and it says touch to continue your change. You got to hit OK, and it's saying you're going to have a high IDE ratio, meaning that it's going to become inverse. You're not going to have enough time for exhalation, and it wants you to recognize that. I'm going to go ahead and override it. Okay, go to 32, but take a look here now. Okay, my proposed minute ventilation is going to be 17.6. My I time doesn't change because these three things are what's responsible for changing my I time. By changing the rate, I'm changing my cycle time. My cycle time is now so short it's less than 2 seconds, at 1.88. Well, if I'm spending 1 second on inspiration, look what it did to my expiratory time. Okay, 1.14 to 1. This is what we call an inverse ratio. A ratio should be 1 to something. Oh, let me zoom in a little better so you can see all that. Should always be 1 to something, not something to 1. Okay, this means we're spending a longer time on inspiration than we have for exhalation, and that could be bad. It could cause air trapping and some major problems with our patients. Okay, so that being said, you'll get doctors that'll tell you that don't know any better, and they'll keep telling you to go up on rate when patients get really, really bad and something's happening with their lungs and they got an immense amount of dead space. Okay, they don't understand that just because you go up on the rate doesn't mean anything. If we end up going inverse ratio, they may not exhale. Okay, if they're not exhaling, they're not reestablishing that CO2 gradient, and it's not going to be as efficient in a gas exchange. Most patients, all right, the only thing that limits how high we can go on the respiratory rate is the progression of auto PEEP. And we'll focus on that as we get into ventilator changes, but let me go ahead and hit accept here. You can see my other alarms are going to go off. High respiratory rate, high minute ventilation. Every time you make a ventilator change, really, we should be adjusting alarms. I'm going to hit silence. I'm going to go here. I'm going to buffer these out a little bit. Go up to 35 on my high respiratory rate. We'll do a 24 on high minute ventilation. Typically, we should be adjusting some of these low values and everything too. So let's take a look. Look at that flow waveform. I'm never really reaching baseline, okay, before the next breath comes in. I still have air leaving my patient's lungs when the next breath kicks in. Well, that could be bad, all right? If you look up on the top here, it's showing me roughly what my PEEP is at the Y, but remember, it's not measuring auto PEEP. This brings us to our first pauses. If we want to see what is really taking place down and in the lungs with a patient, and we're worried about something, we want to know truly what's happening at the lung and not just at the Y, we have to do a pause to allow lung pressure to equilibrate with our circuit. Okay, so in this case, if I do an expiratory pause, which can be found on this quick access button, it's going to essentially allow that patient to fully exhale, but it's going to have the expiratory valve closed. And any trap pressure in the lung is going to equilibrate, going to follow its gradient, go back to the ventilator, and it's going to let me know. So I'm going to hit an expiratory pause. It's telling me. So it does the pause for you automatically. Some vents you have to do this on your own. I only have 0.2 centimeters auto PEEP, which is remarkable because these settings are pretty crazy. And my total PEEP is about 5.8. We'll tolerate auto PEEP. It's not terrible in small amounts, but it can be problematic, and it's important we know how to assess it. So what it does is, once again, we're allowing that patient's lung pressures at exhalation to equilibrate with the ventilator circuit, and it lets us know if any pressure is trapped because it's going to follow its respective gradients. Okay? Most patients, if we had something on this, it would be quite high, and it could cause some major problems. Let me show you the last of the pauses. So we're going to learn a lot about appropriate values for patients and stuff like that, but airway pressures are always a concern. Too much airway pressure at the alveolar level can cause major ventilator-induced lung injury and a lot of problems. So not that I'm not concerned about peak pressure, but we have to realize, and I'm going to zoom out so you can see peak pressure. Peak pressure is the total pressure reached, or the highest pressure reached as you're trying to push that air through the tube. It doesn't necessarily mean that amount of pressure is reaching the lung. Okay, by doing an inspiratory pause, so end inspiratory, it gets a breath in and then does a pause, all right? It closes that expiratory valve and it allows that patient's airway pressures to come back to what the patient's ventilator circuit is, and we can directly measure what's going on in the lung, okay? We know it's typically going to be less than my peak pressure. It could be close, it could be really, really far off, all right? But by doing a pause, we're inflating the lung, and we're indirectly measuring how much force that lung is trying to return back to its resting shape. So we're looking at elastance, essentially, right, or the inverse of compliance. By hitting an inspiratory pause, this ventilator does it for you. Okay, it's going to give the breath. It's going to do a slight pause, usually 1 second, maybe 2 or 3. It's appropriate, but we want to make sure we have a real pressure plateau. All right, that's one thing I don't like about this. People that hit the button and just record the value. I like to actually be able to scroll through and look at it. But it did a little breath pause right here. It tells us what our plateau. So plateau pressure means you're doing a breath hold and you're actually looking at what's truly reaching down to the alveolar level. And 24 is our plateau pressure in that case. Okay, and it's signified here. It'll also try and calculate static lung compliance, another value that we'll talk about as the class kind of progresses. It freezes it so you can look at it. You can go ahead and hit unfreeze. All right, plateau pressures are one of the most important pressures we measure in ventilation, and we'll talk about strategies for how to reduce that, what a safe value is, but typically 30 centimeters of water or less is what we're shooting for. Some of your books even tell you 28, okay? So that is almost the end, or this is essentially the end of this little exercise. You've been exposed to the 980, the 840. One thing about the 840 to remember is there is no standby button, so when we're done, we have to actually turn this thing off. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here in a segment. I'm turning the ventilator off just by hitting this button. No alarm or anything like that goes off. And that'll be that. There'll be more to come here, hopefully. I hope this helps out a little bit. I know it's not opportune to be watching the video instead of be here. We'll get you all squared away, though. All right? Stay safe.